What's good, guys? Prince Sports here. Don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. Keeping it 3,000 as always. And I want to talk to you today about none other than the Wallace brothers, Ben Wallace and Rasheed Wallace. Okay, two guys that was recently talking about LeBron James, criticizing LeBron James, and I want to go over what they said and break down what each person said. And I would have to say this much. I agree with what Ben Wallace said, but I totally disagree with what Rasheed Wallace says about LeBron James. Now, I find it ironic, though, that both of these guys played on the Detroit Pistons, all right? And bad boy Detroit Pistons always talk to their rivalries and, bring that smoke to their rivalries sometimes, too. So I find that ironic that Detroit Pistons always willing to get smoke from people. So, but nevertheless, man, let's go into what Ben Wallace said, okay? Now, Ben Wallace said LeBron James is a great basketball player, which we all could agree to, all right? But he did said if LeBron played in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s, he would not be the LeBron that you know today. And I 100% agree with that. He would not be recognized as the LeBron that you know. Now, when it pertains to a guy like Kobe and Mike, I think they would have been known regardless of what era that they played in, because they were a little different, if you ask me. And even in the early 2000s, LeBron got drafted in 2003. You could tell that, hey, when LeBron first came into the league, even for a couple seasons after that, he was not the best player in the league. That was definitely Kobe Bryant. The only reason why LeBron even was considered the best player in the league over Kobe Bryant was the simple fact that Kobe was getting old and LeBron was the new guy on the come up. That was pretty much it. But if they played prime for prime, really played prime for prime, I don't think LeBron James would have been ranked above Kobe Bryant or even considered above Kobe Bryant. And I think Kobe would have beaten LeBron 2008, 2009 on to 2010. So that's 3 years in a row that he would gave LeBron finals losses on his roster, on his resume, excuse me. Now, if you track back to the 80s and 90s, he would have been he would have had guys like Magic Johnson and all his other guys he would play against in the 80s. I think he would have been still a solid player in the 80s, but he could have been considered the best player in the 80s neither. He had been taking the backseat to a couple players in that era, and I think he would have lost to a lot of players in that era, rather it was in the finals or in the playoffs. I think that their teams would have beaten, a LeBron-led team. And if you do it to the 90s, there's no way, no how, in the words of Rob Parker, that a guy like LeBron James is beating Michael Jordan prime for prime. No way. Michael Jordan would have owned LeBron James physically and mentally, and it would have got ugly. It would have got to a point where it was like abuse, okay? So he would have been taking a back seat to Mike, period, because Michael Jordan was one of a kind, not only in playing on basketball, but his impact on the game was devastating, unlike any other, and nobody has reached the commercial success of a Michael Jordan. So LeBron would have been playing backseat to Mike, and he would have been getting his ass kicked by Mike, because there's no way if LeBron is teamed up with an all-star and role players against Mike teamed up with an all-star and role players, that a LeBron-led team beats a Jordan-led team. Nope. Not buying it. No way, no how. And not only would Jordan destroy LeBron James mentally and physically, because the mind controls the body, but man, it'd have been, like I said, it'd have been ugly. It'd have been ugly. He'd just have been another victim, a Michael Jordan victim. He'd been another guy that's great, but couldn't get over that hump to beat Mike. Only way he would have beat Mike in a 7-game series if he went out and did what he did in 2011. Leave and go and recruit a bunch of all-stars to try to help jump Michael Jordan. That's the only way he could have beat Mike. But playing Mike one-on-one, playing Mike on an even playing field, hell no. Only way LeBron was going to win a championship is if he does, get all top players to come play with him. and you already know how I feel about that. So there's no love lost with that. Um, could have LeBron won a championship the most respectable way? Um, he so-called did in 2020, but you got to keep in mind Anthony Davis was a top 5 player in the league. So you got 2 top 5 players in the league. Y'all supposed to win. Okay, you guys would have been favorites to win anyway. So, you know, but nevertheless, at least it's not a super team. I give you that much. But yeah, man, he'd have been owned by Mike. So he'd have been owned by Mike in the 90s. He'd have been owned by Kobe in the 2000s. And Magic and Bird would have been giving him a whooping. And probably all them other great teams in the 80s would have been knocking him off. Because keep in mind, he was mentally weak coming into the league. So I got to give that nod to Ben Wallace for speaking the truth. But Rasheed Wallace is the complete opposite. He says LeBron James won't be great at all. That's a complete utterly lie. LeBron James would have been great in any era of basketball. He just wouldn't have been the top player is what I'm trying to say. 80s, he could probably been the top 10 player. Realistically, a top 10 player. Maybe a year or two, a season or two, he'd have been considered the best player. But yeah, the 90s, he could have probably been a top 5 in some seasons and a top 10 in some seasons. I think it would have been consistently going up and down. The 2000s, the same way. Okay, you see how the early 2000s played out, and LeBron was second fiddle to Kobe in the early 2000s. Prime Kobe versus prime LeBron. Kobe beats prime LeBron. One-on-one, determination, mentality, who wants it more. No way Kobe would have lost to LeBron James if they was playing on an even playing field without no super team aspect. No way, no how. Prince Sports out. Peace.